The biggest regrets in life aren't the chances we take. They're the people we let walk away. I didn't truly understand those words until the day I stood in the pouring rain, watching my older brother's casket disappear beneath a sea of white lilies, while the only man I had ever secretly loved stood just a few feet away, unable to meet my eyes. The cemetery smelled of wet earth and fresh-cut grass, and the steady rhythm of rain against black umbrellas blurred the world into shades of gray. 6 years had passed since I had last seen Noah Bennett, yet somehow he looked exactly as I remembered him. His dark brown hair was a little shorter, a few faint lines rested around his eyes, and the confident smile that used to brighten every room had vanished completely. He stood with his hands buried deep inside the pockets of his charcoal coat, staring silently at the polished oak casket that carried my brother Ryan away forever. Everyone around us whispered condolences, exchanged gentle hugs, and slowly drifted toward their cars as the service came to an end, but neither Noah nor I moved. We were separated by only a few yards, yet it felt as though an entire lifetime stretched between us. I wanted to ask him why he had disappeared without saying goodbye. I wanted to ask why he never answered the countless messages I had written but never sent. I wanted to ask if he had ever thought about me during those empty years. Instead, I simply looked down at the damp roses trembling in my hands. The last conversation Ryan and I ever had echoed through my mind like a song I could never stop hearing. Some people come into your life for a reason, he had told me with that familiar crooked grin. Just don't wait too long before telling them they matter. At the time I laughed because I thought he was teasing me again. Ryan had always noticed more than he admitted. He saw through awkward smiles, uncomfortable silences, and stolen glances better than anyone I had ever known. Looking back now, I wondered if he had already known everything I had tried so desperately to hide. A cold gust of wind carried the scent of rain across the cemetery, and for the first time Noah finally lifted his head. Our eyes met for only a second. It wasn't anger I saw. It wasn't guilt either. It was something far heavier, something that looked like years of words trapped behind a locked door. Before either of us could speak, Ryan's attorney approached holding a weathered leather envelope with my family name written across the front in my brother's unmistakable handwriting. Ryan wanted this delivered after today's service, he said quietly. He was very specific about who needed to be present when it was opened. My heart skipped as he looked from me to Noah, before placing the envelope carefully into my shaking hands. Written beneath our names was one final sentence in Ryan's familiar handwriting. Everything began on that rainy night. And it's finally time both of you learned the truth. As thunder rolled softly across the distant sky, memories I had spent years trying to bury came rushing back all at once, carrying me to the stormy evening when I was 19 years old, standing by my bedroom window, completely unaware that opening our front door to my brother's best friend would quietly change the course of my entire life forever. The memory returned with startling clarity, as if the rain outside the cemetery had washed away 6 years instead of carrying them further into the past. I was 19 that autumn, still convinced that life moved in predictable directions. Ryan was 24, already working as a junior architect, and he had the effortless confidence of someone who believed every problem could eventually be solved with enough patience and determination. Our parents were spending the weekend visiting our grandparents in Vermont, leaving the two of us alone in the old colonial house where we had grown up on the outskirts of Portland. The weather forecast had promised a light shower, but by early evening the sky had turned almost black. Rain hammered against the windows so hard that it sounded like handfuls of pebbles striking the glass. The wind bent the maple trees until their branches scraped across the roof with long, haunting groans. Ryan glanced toward the front window before grabbing his truck keys from the kitchen counter. Noah's car broke. Down about 5 miles from here, he said while pulling on his rain jacket. I am going to pick him up before the roads flood. I barely looked up from the novel resting in my lap. I had heard Noah's name countless times over the years. Ryan talked about him the way brothers talked about lifelong friends, with stories filled with inside jokes, fishing trips, college memories, and impossible road trips that always sounded a little exaggerated. Somehow, despite living in the same town, I had never actually met him. Either our schedules never lined up, or I happened to be away whenever Noah stopped by. He had always been more of an idea than a real person to me. About 40 minutes later, headlights cut through the curtain of rain outside. The front door swung open, carrying a burst of cold air into the warm house. You would not believe how bad Route 30 looked. Ryan laughed as he shook water from his jacket. Behind him stood someone taller than I expected, holding an overnight bag over one shoulder while brushing soaked dark hair away from his forehead. "Ethan," Ryan called. "Come meet the guy I have been talking about for years." I stepped into the hallway, suddenly aware that I was wearing an old college sweatshirt and a pair of faded sweatpants. Noah offered an easy smile that somehow made the storm outside seem less important. "So you are Ethan," he said warmly. "I finally get to meet the famous little brother." His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who never needed to prove himself. He held out his hand, and when I shook it, his grip was firm without trying to impress anyone. "Ryan talks about you all the time." I laughed awkwardly. "Hopefully only the good stories." Ryan answered before Noah could. "Definitely not only the good ones." The three of us laughed together, and something about that simple moment settled naturally into place, as though Noah had always belonged inside our home. I helped him carry his bag upstairs while Ryan disappeared into the kitchen to start making chili, his favorite meal whenever the weather turned cold. The scent of tomatoes, onions, garlic, and fresh bread soon filled every room. Rain continued tapping against the windows while an old jazz playlist drifted softly through the speakers. It was nothing extraordinary, just three people sharing dinner around a worn wooden table, telling stories that bounced effortlessly from childhood memories to embarrassing college adventures. Yet every time Noah smiled, I found myself paying closer attention than I intended. I noticed the way he listened without interrupting, the way he laughed with his whole face instead of only his mouth, and the quiet kindness hidden inside the smallest gestures, like refilling my glass before I realized it was empty. Looking back now, I realize my life did not change because of one dramatic moment. It changed because that rainy evening quietly introduced me to someone who already felt strangely familiar before I even knew his favorite color, his dreams, or the secret that would one day connect all three of our lives forever. By the time the storm finally drifted east the next morning, I had already convinced myself that Noah was simply another chapter in Ryan's life, someone who would disappear as quickly as he had arrived. I was wrong. That weekend became the beginning of a routine none of us planned. Noah started stopping by the house almost every Friday after work. Sometimes he and Ryan spent hours watching football in the living room while arguing about teams that never seemed to win when it mattered. Other weekends they filled the garage with half-finished woodworking projects or disappeared before sunrise to fish at a nearby lake, returning with more stories than fish every single time. At first I stayed out of their conversations, pretending to study or read while quietly listening from the next room. It was impossible not to notice how different Noah was from everyone else I knew. He never tried to dominate a conversation. He remembered small details that most people forgot. If I mentioned an upcoming chemistry exam, he asked how it went the following week. If I complained about an art assignment, he somehow remembered the deadline days later. Those little things should not have mattered as much as they did, but they slowly became the brightest moments of ordinary weeks. Before long, Ryan began inviting me whenever they made plans. We grabbed burgers at a roadside diner after helping Noah move into a new apartment across town. We wandered through a fall festival where Ryan somehow won a giant stuffed bear after spending far too many dollars trying to impress a group of laughing children. We spent one Saturday afternoon hiking a trail overlooking the Columbia River Gorge, stopping every few minutes because Ryan insisted every viewpoint looked better than the last. Noah carried an old camera around his neck and kept taking candid photographs whenever nobody was paying attention. I caught him once as he lowered the camera after snapping a picture of me sitting on a weathered wooden fence staring across the valley. Embarrassed, I asked him to delete it. He only smiled. "People always look different when they forget someone is watching," he said. "That is usually when they look the most like themselves." I laughed it off, but those words stayed with me far longer than I admitted. Winter arrived quietly, covering rooftops with thin blankets of snow and filling coffee shops with the scent of cinnamon and roasted beans. By then, Noah no longer felt like Ryan's best friend visiting our house. He felt like part of the family. Mom always made enough dinner for him without asking if he was coming. Dad trusted him with projects around the house. Ryan joked that Noah practically paid property taxes because he spent so much time there. Sometimes I caught myself looking toward the driveway whenever I heard a car pull in, hoping it would be his old pickup truck. That realization frightened me more than I wanted to admit. I had never experienced feelings like that before. They appeared gradually, without permission or warning, hidden inside ordinary afternoons and casual conversations. It was never about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was the comfort of hearing his footsteps in the hallway, the familiar sound of his laugh mixing with Ryan's from the kitchen, the way he always asked if I wanted hot chocolate whenever he made coffee for himself. I kept telling myself it was admiration, nothing more. He was older, kind, dependable, and easy to be around. Anyone would enjoy spending time with someone like him. Yet every time another person smiled at him a little too long or laughed a little too loudly at one of his jokes, an unfamiliar ache settled quietly inside my chest. I buried that feeling immediately, reminding myself of one simple truth that should have made everything easier. Noah Bennett was my brother's best friend, and whatever I was beginning to feel had to remain my secret, even from myself. Spring arrived with longer afternoons, blooming dogwood trees, and the quiet confidence that life would keep moving exactly as it always had. Ryan accepted a demanding project that often kept him working late downtown, leaving Noah to stop by the house alone more often than either of us expected. At first it felt slightly awkward. We were so used to Ryan filling every silence with another story that the house seemed unusually peaceful without him. Noah never appeared uncomfortable. He would help Dad repair the back fence, carry groceries inside for Mom, or sit at the kitchen island while I finished homework, reading blueprints spread across the counter with a mug of black coffee cooling beside him. Somehow those ordinary afternoons became my favorite part of every week. We talked about everything that had nothing to do with love. He recommended novels he thought I would enjoy. I introduced him to independent films he had never seen. We argued over whether old vinyl records sounded warmer than digital music. Sometimes we drove to a small bookstore 30 minutes away because it had a cafe overlooking the river. Other times we wandered through the local farmer's market where Noah insisted on buying fresh peaches, even though he always admitted he chose them terribly. I found myself laughing more than I had in years, and every time I looked up, he was already smiling as if he had expected me to. One Friday evening, Ryan called just before dinner. His project manager needed him to stay overnight at a construction site because severe weather was expected to move through the county. "Do not wait up," he joked through the speakerphone. "Noah, keep Ethan from surviving on frozen pizza." Noah laughed and promised he would. By sunset, the sky had turned the deep blue that always came before heavy rain. Thick clouds swallowed the last traces of daylight, while distant thunder rolled softly across the hills. We decided to drive into town before the storm became too strong, picking up sandwiches from the neighborhood deli and stopping at a small bakery for slices of apple pie. On the way home, the first drops began tapping against the windshield. Within minutes, the rain intensified until the road ahead nearly disappeared behind shimmering sheets of water. Noah slowed the truck well below the speed limit, his hands steady on the steering wheel. "Visibility is getting worse," he said calmly. "There is an old lakeside pavilion about a mile ahead. We should wait this one out." I nodded, watching lightning flicker silently beyond the trees. The wooden pavilion overlooked a quiet lake surrounded by tall pines. Rain drummed against its metal roof while cool air carried the scent of wet cedar and fresh earth through the open sides. We sat on a weathered picnic table sharing pie with plastic forks, listening to water splash into the lake below. It should have been an ordinary half hour, nothing more than two people waiting for bad weather to pass. Instead, the silence between us felt strangely comfortable, as though neither of us needed to fill it with unnecessary words. After several minutes, Noah looked across the lake before speaking so quietly I almost missed it. "You are different now." I blinked in surprise. "Different how?" He smiled without looking at me. "The first time I met you, you hardly said 5 words all night. Now you tell stories that make your mother laugh until she cries." I felt heat rise into my face despite the cool breeze. People change. He finally turned toward me, and for a brief moment his expression became thoughtful in a way I had never seen before. "Yes," he said softly. "Sometimes we do not realize how much until one day we look up and the person standing in front of us is no longer the kid we thought we knew." The words lingered in the quiet air long after they were spoken. Outside, the rain continued falling across the dark lake, but something inside me shifted, almost imperceptibly. For the very first time, I wondered if Noah had begun seeing me differently too, and that single impossible thought followed me all the way home beneath the fading storm clouds. The weeks after that rainy evening unfolded with an uneasy kind of hope that I never dared to put into words. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. Noah still came over for Sunday dinners whenever his schedule allowed. Ryan still teased both of us without realizing how every joke made my heart race a little faster. My parents still treated Noah like another son, asking about work, insisting he take leftovers home, and reminding him to stop by even when Ryan was busy. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same anymore. Ever since our conversation at the lakeside pavilion, I kept replaying his words in my mind. He no longer saw me as a kid. That single sentence quietly settled into my thoughts, making every shared glance and every casual smile seem heavier with meaning. I hated myself for reading too much into ordinary moments, but I could not stop. Then one Saturday afternoon, Ryan received an unexpected call from a client and rushed out halfway through our family barbecue, apologizing that he would be back before dessert. Noah offered to stay behind and help clean up, insisting there was no reason for everyone else to do all the work. My parents headed inside to prepare coffee while I gathered empty plates from the patio. A warm breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the backyard, and somewhere beyond the fence a neighbor's wind chimes rang softly. Noah was folding lawn chairs when he noticed me struggling to carry a heavy cooler across the deck. Without saying a word, he walked over, lifted one side, and together we carried it into the garage. It was such an ordinary moment that I almost laughed at myself for noticing how naturally we moved together, each adjusting our pace without needing directions. After everything was put away, we remained standing in the quiet garage for a moment longer than necessary. Sunlight filtered through the small side window, filling the room with floating dust particles that shimmered like tiny stars. Noah leaned against the workbench and smiled. College starts again in a few weeks. Are you excited? I shrugged. A little. Mostly nervous. You will do fine, he replied without hesitation. You work harder than you give yourself credit for. I looked down at my shoes because hearing encouragement from him somehow meant more than hearing it from anyone else. You always seem so sure about people, I admitted. He laughed softly. Not always. I have made plenty of mistakes. Really, more than you know. His smile faded into something thoughtful. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that protect people, even if they never understand why you made them. Before I could ask what he meant, a cool breeze swept through the open garage door. Dark clouds had begun gathering again, surprising us after such a bright afternoon. Within minutes, the first raindrops began falling across the driveway. We stepped onto the front porch just as the shower quickly intensified, watching the rain dance across the street. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence felt peaceful instead of awkward. I turned toward him at the exact moment he looked at me. Our eyes met, and time seemed to slow in a way I still cannot fully explain. There was no grand confession, no reckless decision, only an unspoken understanding that something fragile had quietly changed between us. Noah opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something important, then stopped himself. Instead, he smiled with unmistakable sadness and gently rested his hand on my shoulder for only a brief second before letting it fall away. Ethan, he said almost in a whisper, promise me one thing. What is that? He looked out at the rain instead of answering immediately. No matter what happens, never think that you were the reason someone walked away. Before I could ask what those words meant, Ryan's truck pulled into the driveway, breaking the moment apart as completely as if it had never happened at all. For a little while, I believed nothing would ever change. Summer faded into early fall, classes became more demanding, and life settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt almost permanent. Noah still visited whenever he could, although his work seemed to pull him farther away each week. He apologized more often for arriving late, answered more phone calls than before, and occasionally stared out the window, as though he was carrying thoughts too heavy to share. I noticed every small difference because I had unknowingly built my days around the moments when he was near. Looking back now, I think he had already made his decision long before anyone else realized it. I simply could not see it because I was too busy hoping. One Friday afternoon, I finished class early and decided to surprise Ryan at his office downtown with coffee from his favorite cafe. As I stepped into the building lobby, I froze when I saw Noah standing near the elevators. He was dressed in a navy jacket with a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm, speaking quietly with Ryan. Neither of them had noticed me yet. I was about to wave when I saw Ryan place a reassuring hand on Noah's shoulder. Their expressions were unusually serious. I could not hear every word, only scattered pieces carried across the polished marble floor. "Are you sure?" Ryan asked. Noah nodded slowly. "It is the only choice that makes sense." Ryan looked down before answering. "He is going to blame himself." Noah closed his eyes for a brief moment. "That is exactly what I am trying to prevent." Before I could understand what they meant, the elevator doors opened. Noah stepped inside first. Just before the doors closed, his eyes met mine across the lobby. Surprise flashed across his face, followed almost immediately by something that looked heartbreakingly close to regret. He started to move as though he wanted to step back out, but the doors slid shut between us. Ryan turned around only then and immediately forced a smile. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" I held up the coffee carrier, pretending everything was normal. "Thought you could use a break." He smiled gratefully, but his eyes kept drifting toward the elevator that had already disappeared. 2 days later, Noah did not come to dinner. He did not answer Ryan's calls that evening either, which was unusual enough to make everyone wonder if he had been caught up at work. Monday passed, then Tuesday. By Wednesday, Ryan finally received a short message. Noah had accepted a position with an engineering firm in Seattle. He had already moved over the weekend because the opportunity required him to begin immediately. There was no farewell dinner, no visit to the house, no explanation beyond a polite message thanking my family for treating him like one of their own. I read those words so many times that I eventually memorized every sentence. My phone remained silent. There was no message addressed to me, no final conversation, not even a simple goodbye. Every evening, I found myself staring at his contact information, wondering whether I should call first. I never did. Pride can be a strange disguise for heartbreak. Weeks became months. Ryan occasionally mentioned Noah during family dinners, saying he seemed busy adjusting to his new job, but even those updates became less frequent over time. I buried myself in school, convinced that if I stayed busy enough, the emptiness would eventually disappear. It never truly did. Some absences become part of the furniture of your life. You stop noticing them every day, but you still arrange everything around the space they left behind. The hardest part was not that Noah had gone. It was remembering the promise he asked me to make while we stood watching the rain together. "Never think that you were the reason someone walked away." I repeated those words to myself for years, but no matter how desperately I wanted to believe them, one impossible question refused to leave me alone. If I was not the reason, then why did he leave without even saying goodbye? 6 years disappeared in what felt like the blink of an eye. Yet grief had a strange way of making every forgotten memory return with perfect clarity. I stood beneath the gray sky outside the cemetery chapel long after most of the guests had gone home, still holding Ryan's unopened envelope while rain continued falling in slow, patient waves across the empty parking lot. Noah remained several yards away, speaking quietly with Ryan's attorney before finally turning toward me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The silence between us felt heavier than anything either of us could have said. He looked older now, not because of the faint lines near his eyes or the silver beginning to appear near his temples, but because he carried himself like someone who had spent years living with a decision he could never undo. I almost walked away. 6 years of unanswered questions had taught me that protecting my heart sometimes meant refusing to reopen old wounds. But before I could take a single step, Noah spoke my name so softly that I barely heard it over the rain. "Ethan." It was the first time I had heard his voice in years, and somehow it sounded exactly the same. Familiar, calm, gentle enough to break something inside me all over again. I turned without saying anything. He hesitated before walking closer, stopping several feet away as though an invisible line separated the lives we had once shared from the strangers we had become. "I am sorry," he said quietly. I let out a hollow laugh before I could stop myself. "For which part?" His eyes dropped toward the wet pavement. "For all of it." The answer should have brought relief, but instead it made the years of silence hurt even more. "You disappeared," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "You left without saying goodbye. Not even one message." He closed his eyes briefly, as though every word landed exactly where he expected it would. "I know." "Why?" The question escaped before I could swallow it. Did I do something wrong? His head lifted immediately. No. The answer came so quickly that it almost startled me. You never did anything wrong. Then why? Another long silence settled between us. Rain rolled from the edge of the chapel roof, splashing quietly onto the stone walkway. Noah looked toward Ryan's grave before speaking again. Because staying would have been selfish. I frowned, unable to understand. That does not make any sense. It will, he answered sadly. Just not today. Frustration rose inside me. After 6 years, I had expected an explanation, not another mystery wrapped in half-finished sentences. Before I could press him again, Ryan's attorney approached carrying a small brass key attached to a weathered leather tag. Ryan asked me to give you this after the two of you had spoken, he said, placing it into my hand. It opens a safety deposit box at First Columbia Bank. He left instructions that it should only be opened when both of you were present. Noah looked genuinely surprised. He never told me about this. Neither did I know what Ryan had been planning. I stared down at the old key resting in my palm, noticing the numbers engraved into its worn metal surface. Suddenly, the envelope in my other hand felt much heavier than before. Ryan had known this moment would happen long before any of us stood beside his grave. Somehow, my brother had expected Noah and me to find our way back to each other after years apart. As another low rumble of thunder rolled across the cloudy afternoon, I realized the answers I had spent 6 years chasing had never disappeared with Noah. They had been waiting patiently for us inside something Ryan had chosen to leave behind. The following morning, Noah and I met outside First Columbia Bank just as the city was beginning to wake. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath a pale autumn sun that struggled through the clouds. For a few moments, we stood silently beside the entrance, neither of us knowing whether to begin with small talk or simply accept that too many years had passed for ordinary conversation. Eventually, Noah held the door open, and together we stepped into the quiet marble lobby. Ryan had rented the safety deposit box nearly 3 years earlier, according to the bank manager, and the instructions were unusually specific. Both of our signatures were required before it could be opened. My hands trembled slightly as I inserted the old brass key into the lock. Inside rested only 3 things: a sealed envelope addressed to both of us, a small flash drive, and an old photograph that immediately stole the air from my lungs. It was the picture Noah had secretly taken of me during our hike overlooking the Columbia River Gorge. I remembered asking him to delete it. He never had. Ryan must have somehow gotten a copy. I carefully unfolded the letter first. Ryan's familiar handwriting filled the page, steady and unmistakable. If you are reading this together, it began, then one of my last wishes has already come true. My vision blurred almost immediately. There is something both of you have been carrying for far too long. Noah has been carrying guilt. Ethan has been carrying questions. It is time for both burdens to end. I looked up at Noah, who had gone completely still beside me. My heart pounded as I continued reading. Noah came to me the week before he left for Seattle. He told me he had fallen in love with someone he believed he had no right to love. Before he even finished speaking, I already knew who he meant. I had watched the two of you for months. I saw the way Ethan smiled differently whenever you arrived. I saw the way you looked at him when you thought nobody noticed. Neither of you was nearly as good at hiding your feelings as you believed. I stopped reading, unable to breathe for a moment. Noah quietly covered his face with one hand. I asked Noah one question, Ryan wrote. Was he willing to spend the rest of his life protecting my little brother's happiness, even if that meant giving up his own? He answered yes without hesitation. Tears gathered in my eyes as the next lines came into focus. I was the one who told him to leave. I stared at the page, convinced I had misunderstood. He wanted to stay? I convinced him that Ethan deserved the chance to discover who he was without feeling pressured by an older man who had become part of our family. I told Noah that if what the two of you shared was real, time would not destroy it. If it disappeared, then it was never meant to last. Leaving broke his heart, but he trusted my judgment because he trusted me. My hands shook so hard I nearly dropped the letter. Every story I had told myself during the past 6 years collapsed in a single moment. Noah had never abandoned me because he stopped caring. He had walked away because my own brother had asked him to. I turned toward Noah, unable to speak. His eyes were filled with quiet regret. I promised Ryan I would never tell you, he whispered. Every day I wanted to call. Every birthday. Every holiday. I almost broke that promise. More times than I can count. But he believed you deserved the freedom to choose your own future without feeling that either of us had chosen it for you. I looked back down at the letter and read Ryan's final words aloud through trembling breaths. If life has been kind enough to bring the two of you back into the same room again, then stop wasting time mourning years that neither of you truly lost. Some people are worth waiting for, especially when they already feel like home. 3 weeks later, I asked Noah to meet me at the old lakeside pavilion where we had once waited for a storm to pass all those years ago. Autumn had painted the trees in shades of amber and crimson, and a gentle drizzle floated across the lake like a memory refusing to disappear. The weather felt strangely familiar, as though the world itself had quietly circled back to where our story had truly begun. I arrived first, carrying Ryan's letter carefully folded inside my jacket pocket. I had read it so many times that every sentence now lived permanently in my heart. When Noah's truck finally pulled into the small gravel parking lot, he climbed out slowly, looking almost uncertain for the first time since I had ever known him. We walked toward the pavilion together without speaking. There was no need to rush anymore. The silence that once separated us had become something softer, filled with understanding instead of unanswered questions. We stood side by side watching raindrops ripple across the calm surface of the lake. After several quiet minutes, I smiled gently. "You know," I said, "I used to think this place was where everything fell apart." Noah looked toward the water before answering. "So did I." I reached into my jacket and handed him Ryan's letter. I think he knew better than both of us. Noah held the letter against his chest without opening it. His eyes glistened as he looked toward the distant shoreline. "There has not been a single day that I stopped caring about you," he admitted quietly. "Not one birthday. Not one holiday. Not one rainy afternoon. I kept every postcard I almost mailed. I wrote messages I never sent because I promised Ryan I would let you build your own life. First, every year I wondered if I had already waited too long." I smiled through tears that no longer felt heavy. "You did not lose 6 years," I answered softly. "Neither did I. We spent those years becoming the people we needed to be before we could finally stand here honestly." Noah laughed quietly, the familiar sound carrying across the lake exactly as I remembered from years before. Ryan always believed he was the smartest person in the room. "Most of the time," I replied, "he probably was." We both laughed together, and for the first time since Ryan's funeral, the laughter did not carry guilt. It carried gratitude. A gentle breeze moved through the pine trees as light rain continued falling around us. Noah reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out an old photograph. It was the same picture he had taken of me on the mountain overlook years ago. The edges had faded slightly, but the smile on my younger face remained untouched by time. "I kept this with me everywhere," he said. "Whenever work became overwhelming or I questioned whether leaving had been the right choice, I looked at this picture and reminded myself that loving someone sometimes means trusting tomorrow more than today." I studied the photograph before looking back at him. "Then let tomorrow begin now." His eyes widened slightly before the quiet uncertainty that had followed him for years finally disappeared. He stepped closer and gently took my hand, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I did not. Instead, I held his hand just as naturally as if it had always belonged there. Above us, the clouds slowly parted, allowing a narrow beam of afternoon sunlight to spread across the lake while the last raindrops shimmered like tiny pieces of glass. I suddenly remembered something Ryan had once told me long before any of this had happened. "Some people enter your life exactly when they are supposed to," he had said. Standing there beside Noah, I finally understood what my brother had been trying to teach both of us all along. Love was never measured by the years we lost to silence. It was measured by the courage to return when life finally offered a second chance. As we walked away from the pavilion together, leaving only gentle footprints on the rain-soaked path behind us, I realized that the storm I had spent years trying to forget had never been the end of my story. It had quietly become the place where my future had been waiting all along.